All right, ready for a deep dive. Today we're tackling something that, honestly, I think a lot of us get confused about: autistic meltdowns versus panic attacks.
Yeah, it's a really important distinction.
It's one of those things you think you kind of get, but then you realize there's a lot more to it.
Totally. And getting it wrong, like thinking a meltdown is just a temper tantrum, that can really make things harder.
Exactly. So let's break it down. We've got some great info from cheap ABA Understanding Autistic Meltdowns and Panic Attacks to guide us.
It's a solid article.
So first things first, when we say autistic meltdown, what are we really talking about?
Okay, so the article makes a point right away that's super important. Meltdowns aren't about someone trying to get something.
Right. It's not like a tantrum where a kid wants candy.
Exactly. It's
Ah.
different. It's a reaction to being totally overwhelmed.
Oh, I see. And often it's because of sensory input.
Yeah, and this is key. The autistic brain, it processes sensory information differently, like way differently. Imagine everything around you, the lights, sounds, even how your clothes feel, all amplified. Way up.
Intense.
That's kind of what it can be like for someone on the spectrum.
So it's not just like, oh, it's a little loud in here. It's their whole sensory experience going haywire.
Right. The article even uses fluorescent lights as an example, that flickering.
Oh, yeah.
Many people barely notice it. But for someone with autism, it can be super distracting, really uncomfortable. It's not just a minor annoyance, it's major sensory overload.
So it's like their system is going too much, too much.
Exactly.
So in a way, a meltdown is almost like a defense mechanism.
Yes, it is. A response to this intensity that most of us just don't experience.
So meltdowns are about overload. But then the article talks about panic attacks, too. And I gotta say, I wasn't totally sure I knew the difference before reading this.
Yeah, it gets tricky.
They seem different, but then
They can look really similar, especially physically.
totally. So, okay, if both a meltdown and a panic attack, they can both involve, like, your heart racing, sweating, even that feeling like you can't breathe.
Yeah.
How do you tell them apart then?
It's all about the root cause. Like we were saying, meltdowns, they come from sensory or emotional overload, right? But panic attacks, they're tied to anxiety disorders.
Okay.
It's this sudden wave of fear, anxiety, like out of nowhere.
So different triggers, but your body freaks out in the same way, kind of.
Right, it's that fight or flight response. Your body's like, danger. Whether it's a flickering light or a scary thought, same system kicks in.
Wow, so for the person going through it, that's got to be so confusing to even know what's happening in the moment.
Absolutely, it's a jumble. And that's why understanding the difference is so important, not just for them, but for anyone who's supporting them, you know?
And I guess that's where something like creating a calm down space comes in. The article mentioned that. What does that even look like, practically speaking?
Oh, yeah, I loved that part. Super practical tips. It's basically you make a dedicated spot where someone can go to get away from sensory overload or to deal with that anxiety,
Okay.
like dim lights, comfy pillows, maybe noise-canceling headphones, whatever brings that feeling of safety and control back.
It's like a reset button, but for your senses.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be fancy or anything. It's about what works for that individual person.
This whole conversation is making me think, for people who are caring for, say, an autistic child, even if you intellectually get that a meltdown isn't a tantrum, just witnessing it,
Oh, it's tough. It's really hard.
there's got to be so much emotion tied into that.
For sure. Caregiver burnout, it's real, and not understanding what's happening, it makes it way worse.
So knowing the difference, meltdown versus tantrum, it's not just semantics, it's giving those caregivers the tools to react differently.
Absolutely. With compassion instead of anger.
Right.
And it lets them build strategies that actually help, like that calm down space
Right.
that's proactive, that support.
Having the right tools for the job.
Yes. And sometimes the most important tool is knowing when to call in an expert, right? When to get professional help.
Yeah, having an expert in your back pocket, that's got to make a difference.
Oh, for sure. Like you wouldn't try to fix a car without knowing what you were doing, right? Same goes for this.
Right. You want someone who really knows their stuff.
Exactly. They can help figure out the specific triggers, teach ways to cope, and give everyone involved better tools to work with.
So it's not just about putting out the fire every time, it's about preventing the fire in the first place.
Exactly. And that kind of gets to what got me thinking about all this, because the article, it focuses on how to help the autistic person, right?
Right.
But what about the people around them, the ones who are there for every meltdown, every panic attack?
That's such a good point. They need support too.
Big time. It's not just about knowing the difference between a meltdown and a tantrum. It's that emotional weight too, you know?
Oh, for sure. You're talking about burnout,
Mhm.
compassion, fatigue. Those are real things.
Exactly. So how can those caregivers, how can they take care of themselves so they can keep taking care of their loved
Right,
ones?
you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. It's different for everyone, but self-care, that's crucial. Support groups, mindfulness, setting boundaries, whatever helps them recharge, because it is a marathon, not a sprint.
That's so true. Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to digest today. We've covered what autistic meltdowns are, how they're different from panic attacks, even touched on some practical things like those calm down spaces.
And we can't forget about the importance of self-care for caregivers. That's huge.
Absolutely. And to anyone listening who's touched by this topic personally, please, you're not alone. There's help out there. Don't be afraid to ask for it. Until next time, keep those brains engaged, and thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.